the kids' school again, and I was like,
Yeah, me too. I have a little one in daycare and I cannot handle more closures at all.
I know. I was like,
Oh, yes.
I think we are live streaming, right?
We are live. Yes.
Great.
Okay. Okay. Assalamualaikum, everyone. Thank you for joining our Know Your Rights series, episode number 4. Know Your Rights, interacting with the law enforcement. Today we are joined by Molly Carney. She began a legal career in a private practice in Chicago, focusing on trust and estate. She later clerked for a federal district judge in St. Louis. Also spent a few years in-house at Wells Fargo, where she supported the retail brokerage business. And now she is the staff attorney at ACLU, where she litigates all kinds of civil liberties cases throughout Missouri. And our very own Huma Shah. Huma, you're on mute.
Oh, yes. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our Know Your Rights event, episode 4. We are so glad to have Molly speak to us tonight. And I believe Molly has a presentation that she wants to share with us. So Molly, whenever you're ready, go for it.
Yeah, I do. If you bear with me a moment, I'll share my screen. And then before I get started, if folks have questions, is there a way to get the questions to me?
Towards the end of the presentation, I will be asking the questions.
Yeah,
Oh, okay, perfect.
Collecting them from the audience members.
Yes, Facebook and Instagram.
Okay, good. Yeah, because I was going to just start by saying, if there are any questions, feel free to ask throughout, but it sounds like maybe the best thing to do is we'll collect them. Any questions that any of you all have, I'm happy to answer. And if I can't give you an answer because it's too fact specific or something, can always try to get you an answer later. So definitely appreciate any questions. Okay, so I will start screen sharing for my presentation. Can you all see this? Good. Okay. All right. So, I was asked to speak tonight about interactions with police, which is a pretty big, broad category, but I'm going to be talking through a few different scenarios that might happen with police, especially traffic stops is a big one. What happens if you're stopped when you're walking on the street? What happens if police come to your home? Different kinds of examples like that. I might start with a little bit of background about the ACLU of Missouri. ACLU stands for American Civil Liberties Union, and it's a national organization that upholds civil liberties and rights of people in the US. And I'm based with the Missouri affiliate. So there's a nationwide organization, and then there are affiliate organizations in each state. So in Missouri, we've got a Missouri specific organization with about 12 staff members, including 5 attorneys who, we work on all kinds of lawsuits, anything to do with constitutional rights, with civil liberties, which really runs the gamut. We certainly have cases that involve police interactions where the police have violated people's rights by, it really runs the gamut. It can be a traffic stop where they search a car and they're not supposed to do it, or it could be a protest where the police arrest people just for exercising their rights. Or we have case that I'll talk about where someone was just filming the police and they arrested her. So there are all kinds of different violations that we work with. We also do policy work. So that would be in the legislature, both the Missouri State Legislature and then locally. I'm based in St. Louis. There's some other folks throughout the state, but for example, they'll work with the St. Louis City Council to try to pass legislation that will help people in the city to have their rights upheld. So we're very busy. There's always new, interesting, exciting things coming in. But I will start by just kind of giving an overview, because I mentioned we talk about constitutional rights. That's what we're upholding at the ACLU. So I'm sure everyone's heard about the US Constitution. It's a very short document, but there's so much meaning in that pretty short document. It's something that applies to every person in the US. Doesn't matter if you're a citizen or not, it applies to you. And you have rights if you're a person who's located here. Specifically, you may have also heard about the Bill of Rights, which establishes the really fundamental rights of people. So the First Amendment is the rights of religion, speech, expression, protest. That comes up a lot in police cases. Like I mentioned, cases where the police might try to arrest someone for protesting or for observing them. People have a First Amendment right to be in public spaces, to protest, to express themselves. And so state officials like police can't infringe upon those rights. There's also a Fourth Amendment right, which is the right to be free from unreasonable search and seizure. So we'll talk about that both in the context of traffic stops and what happens if you're stopped when you're walking down the street or if the police come to your home. They can't just say automatically, I'm going to search you, give me all of your belongings. They have to have a reason to do that. So that's the Fourth Amendment. And then a couple of other important ones are the Fifth and the 14th, which they establish the idea of equal protection. So that's the government can't treat you differently based on characteristics like race or your immigration status, your gender, your national origin, your ethnicity, your religion, and the list goes on. And, that's an important one because it's very difficult to prove sometimes, and sometimes you need a lot of different examples, but there are times where it's very clear that the government is choosing to treat certain groups of people differently. And we want to be aware of that and we want to protect that. And so all of these rights, they're under the US Constitution, but there's also a Missouri state constitution that has similar rights for people. And then there are also other laws, we refer to them as statutes. So both locally and then statewide and then federally, there are different levels of statutes that establish rights as well. So when the ACLU is bringing a case, we'll be starting with the US Constitution, but then we'll also look to all those other laws to try to figure out where the rights are and what the rights are. And then the other important source of rights that is a big part of our work is their case laws. There are courts locally and statewide and nationally again. So it's the different levels again, where judges will decide what these rights are and how broad they are. Because the Constitution itself, it might just say there's a right of religion, but then there are hundreds of thousands of cases where judges have said, what does it mean to have a right of religion? And who has those rights? And what happens when the government just pretends that those rights don't exist? How can we enforce that? So a big part of what we do when we're bringing cases and litigating them is we're looking through all those cases and trying to find cases that are similar, with similar facts, with similar law, and trying to tie it all together. And often we're trying to make better law. So we have cases the next time something bad happens where we can point to it and say, no, a judge has said you're not allowed to do that. So I'm going to start with talking about traffic stops. I think that's an important one. I'm an ACLU attorney, and I still get nervous if I have a police car following me. There are a few times I've been pulled over, and it's absolutely nerve-wracking and scary for me too. So if it's scary, that's a normal reaction. Unfortunately, we live in a world where sometimes there's reason to be scared because sometimes the police have been known to do sort of crazy things, both at traffic stops and other interactions with people. And unfortunately, if you're someone who the police, for some reason, identifies as a minority, whether it's the color of your skin or, if you were wearing a head covering or if there's some other identifying characteristic, they might treat you even worse. And so you just have to be careful. And unfortunately, there's sometimes reasons that you kind of have to be a little bit fearful. But I'll talk through some of the basic principles of what to do and what happens if the police stop you. And number one, the absolute most important thing is to just stay calm, even though it's really scary. And even though the police can do harmful things, you just have to stay calm. You know, if it means just reciting something in your head, like a prayer or a happy thought or something, you know, just whatever you can do to make yourself stay calm. That's really the most important thing. You know, even if you don't know why they pulled you over, if you think you're in a hurry and they shouldn't have pulled you over, don't be confrontational with them. Don't fight them. Just stop the car, be in a safe place, and just listen. So yeah, that's the next bullet, you know, stop in a safe place. If you're on the highway, you'll want to pull over to the right side of the highway, you know, of course, out of traffic. If you're on a really narrow city street and you see a gas station or something that's very close by, you could pull over in there. But you don't want to keep on driving if there's a police car that has their lights on behind you. You want to stop as soon as possible. So find a safe place to stop as soon as you can. And then once you've pulled over and stopped, you'll turn off the car, open your driver's side window. Certainly always keep your hands visible. This applies anytime the police are stopping you, whether you're driving in traffic or if you're stopped on the street. You always want them to be able to see your hands. That's both something that the police will use against you. They'll use it as a reason to try to search you, or they'll use it if something goes wrong. They'll say, oh, well, I couldn't see their hands. I didn't know what they were doing. So if you're in your car, the best thing to do is just keep your hands on the steering wheel as much as you can. You know, if they're asking you for paperwork, which they likely will at some point, you can get your paperwork, but just make sure that they can see your hands. And if you are reaching for your paperwork, you're telling them, I'm just reaching to get my ID. This is what I'm doing. Talk them through it. So they don't think that you're trying to get a gun, for example, which, you know, most likely you aren't driving around with a gun, but police often jump to conclusions. And the other thing, you don't want to give them reason to think that you're trying to hide something. If like they see you rustling around with your hands when they're walking up, they might think it's, you know, a gun or drugs or something, and then they'll want to search your car. So just keeping your hands visible is the best thing you can do. You know, you got to stay in the car if you're the driver. You can't leave, you can't run, you can't drive away until the officer tells you you can. So you just have to stay there. Sometimes it takes a lot of time. Like it'll take a lot of time for them to, so their lights are on, you're pulled over, you're in your car, you're waiting for them. And then it might take them a while before they walk to your car. Sometimes they'll come to your car, they'll get paperwork, they'll go back to their car, and then it'll take them a while because they're running something through the system. And then they've got to come back to bring you your paperwork. So getting pulled over, you know, it can end up being 20, 30 minutes where you're just like sitting there, which, you know, if you have somewhere to be, that's a long time, but you just have to stay there. And you've got to stay in the car, even if it's that situation where they've got your paperwork, they've left, it's taking a while, just don't get out of the car because they might see that as a threat as well. Or they might see it, they might think you're trying to run away, even if you're like thinking that you want to ask them a question or, you know, I know in some places it's normal to get out of the car when the police come, but certainly stay in your car. The only exception would be for a passenger. So if you're a passenger but not a driver in a car, you actually are free to leave. You should still ask the police officer if you can leave. But if, like, for example, you're in a city and you're down the street from your home, the police doesn't have reason to detain you just because you're a passenger in the car. So that, I mean, it can get a little bit tricky, and I wouldn't say that you necessarily want to try to leave, but if you really feel a need to leave, you have that option as a passenger. I mentioned that the police officer is probably going to ask to see documents. They usually ask for a driver's license. If you don't have a driver's license and you have some kind of other state identification card, you know, certainly if you have that, you should give it to them. Also the vehicle registration and the proof of insurance. So I know in St. Louis, a lot of people drive around without registered cars, which, you know, that's up to you. But if you do that, you run the risk of getting pulled over and then getting in trouble. And it can be pretty costly if you're driving around without a registration or without insurance. So just be prepared for that. And those are things that they are allowed to request from you, and you should give them. You certainly don't give them any false documents. If you don't have a license or something, don't give them something fake, because that will get you in more trouble. But if you do have a license or a registration, give it to them. And if they ask to search your car, you can say no. It's frustrating. It says on the slide, they may search it anyways, which is true. They need to have a reason. Police officers can't just search any car for no reason. Even if they pull you over for speeding, or if they pull you over because you've got a taillight out, that's not a reason for them to search your trunk. That being said, police officers often do get away with searching cars. They'll say something like, "Oh, I thought I smelled marijuana," or "I thought I saw a metal something sticking out from under the carpet, and I thought that was reason to search." And usually they would get away with that. So even if you're someone who has never smoked marijuana in your life and there's no way that they smelled it, they would get away with searching your car. So unfortunately, that's a situation where you may just have to comply. It's good to go ahead and say no, to get that on the sort of like on the record for later if you were to bring like a legal challenge. But I would say, as a default, that's something where it's okay to say no as a default. And even though they may do it anyways, you won't get in trouble for saying no. So the next part of the traffic stops is thinking about what kinds of things the police might be asking you and how you should answer those questions. So, I don't know how many people on this call know people or are themselves immigrants, but if you're someone who is an immigrant, citizen or not, you don't have to answer questions about your immigration status, about where you were born, about how you came to the country, about whether you're a citizen of another place. You also don't have to show any immigration papers to any police officer. If you were in front of an immigration agent, you might have to, but the police officer who's pulling you over on the side of the street for a traffic stop is most likely not an immigration agent. So you don't need to be talking about your immigration status with them. And if they keep asking you questions about it, you can, at that point, I would ask for a lawyer or say, we need to talk to my lawyer, but you have no requirement of answering those kinds of questions at all. And you don't have to bring any papers or have immigration papers on you. As mentioned before, if you do have like a state license or driver's license, that kind of thing, you should provide that, but there's no requirement to do anything with respect to immigration. And don't provide any fake documents if you have them. But as mentioned before, more trouble. But throughout questioning, whenever the police is asking you questions, you always do have the right to remain silent. So that could be a question about immigration status, or that could be a question about why were you speeding? You don't have to answer their questions. Sometimes, if they ask you, why were you speeding? If the answer is, I'm late to get my kid from school, maybe it's not a bad thing to answer the question. Sometimes that kind of a conversation can actually be a little bit helpful if it's just an everyday traffic stop. But with some officers, any kind of answer doesn't help, because they'll say, oh, well, that means you were speeding because you just admitted to why you were speeding. And so they can trap you a little bit. So you just kind of have to be careful about that. And it's hard because it just depends on the officer, because some of them are really, nice people. They're trying to do their job, and many of them are trying to trap you.
Sorry to interrupt, but I've always been told when a police officer stops you and they say, do you know why we stopped you? Your answer should always be no.
I think, yes. I think that's a good default to say, no, I don't know why you stopped me. I think what I said was, why were you speeding? Which, is a little bit different, because then they're saying, oh, well, I'm going to give you a speeding ticket, is kind of what I was thinking. I was thinking you're in the situation where they're saying, I'm going to give you a ticket. But But I think you're right. I think that's a good default rule to just say, no, I don't know why you stopped me, and go from there.
There have been a couple of times where I genuinely did not know. Like, I mean, there were times when I was speeding and I'm like, yeah, I know, but there were a couple of times that I'm like, I have no idea what you want from me. So
Yeah,
yeah,
same.
yeah.
Yeah, I had one where it was like, there was some kind of, they thought there was a cover on my license plate or something, and I literally had no idea what he was even talking about. And yeah, and that's what's so scary about it, because yeah, either you genuinely don't know, or even if you are speeding, maybe that's not the reason they saw to pull you over. So,
Yeah. It was the registration sticker on my license plate that had expired. And like, I mean, I had no idea that had happened. And so I was truly very confused when I got pulled over for that.
oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Did you get a ticket for it?
I did. And it was during COVID. I'm like, I couldn't go to the, I think the office that, where you get the stickers from, they were closed.
Oh
and
yeah.
doing stuff online. I'm like, I truly was not trying to, get away with something. I couldn't get it renewed. So yeah.
It's challenging. Yeah, it's so frustrating. And that's frustrating because like yeah, in St. Louis, I see people driving around with like no license plates and all this stuff. And that's where you kind of do have to be careful, because you sometimes wonder, like, why did they choose to pull me over now for this thing? And it might not be even for the reason they say.
I'm really glad you brought up the immigration status issue, because a lot of CAIR's clients in the communities we deal with, they are immigrants and they don't know this stuff. And police practices may be very different in their country of origin. So yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, that they don't have to have immigration documents on them if they're pulled over.
Yeah. And yeah, I remember you had mentioned that story of a person who had that kind of an issue where they thought, oh, I'll just get out of the car because that's what I do. And you have to, like, for one of the many reasons it's challenging to be in a new country, you have to like think about these things, and it really could be a life or death issue. And
right. He said in Sri Lanka, we get out of the car, we go talk to the police officer and find out why we're in trouble. And here he's like, the police officer pulled out his gun. And he got scared too. He's like, why are you doing that? And he's like, oh, I thought you were going to attack me. And he's like, no, I just wanted to know why I got pulled over.
right.
So
Yeah, it's really scary. It's a lot. And yeah, it is also difficult that there are these distinctions for immigrants and for non-citizens especially. And because they're also, I guess now is a good time to mention, like, there are also distinctions if you're dealing with immigration agents, which I guess it says here, if an immigration agent is requesting to see papers, then you have to provide them. And I'm going to talk about like what happens if you're arrested a little bit later on. There are also like differences in how you are treated and in your rights if you are detained by an ICE officer versus a police officer. And often it's less rights when you are detained by an ICE officer, sure, which, might not be surprising to anyone, but something to be aware of.
But just out of curiosity, I mean, ICE officers aren't out patrolling the streets in force what are the odds that you're going to get pulled over by an ICE officer?
Absolutely right. Yeah, I think if you're pulled over by flashing lights, in St. Louis especially, it's not going to be an ICE officer. At your house, an ICE officer might come to your house. That could happen. But an officer who just pulls you over randomly on the street, or if you're walking and you run into an officer, it's usually going to be just a local police officer. Yeah. Are there any other questions right now?
No, those are just from us.
No, that's good. I appreciate it. And it's nice to have like the real life examples, like, and to know that I'm not the only one who gets pulled over sometimes.
I got pulled over last week for allegedly blowing through a stop sign, and I didn't. But so that's what I was told.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Okay. So also, my next slide. It also kind of lines up with what we were just talking about, which is racial profiling. And that's something that very much happens throughout the US, happens in St. Louis. And that's when law enforcement, so that includes police officers who are driving in the streets, engage in discrimination because they target people allegedly for suspecting them of a crime based on their race, their ethnicity, their religion, their national origin. So earlier we talked about the 14th Amendment and how there's these rights to equal protection, and government officials aren't allowed to discriminate on the basis of these characteristics. And racial profiling is when officers violate that by deciding that they're going to pull someone over because they're not white. That's usually the most common case, or they're going to stop someone on the street because they're not white. And they're doing it, they might, after the fact, they might say, oh, well, it was because of your license plate or you were speeding, but the reason they pulled you over is because you had black or brown skin. And that does happen in St. Louis. I think I wrote down some of the numbers. Black drivers in St. Louis in like the past 10 years, they're 25% more likely than white drivers to be arrested in a traffic stop. And they're also like about 1% more likely to have their cars be searched, more likely to be cited, to have a record with respect to traffic offenses. So, in St. Louis, because there is, it's like, I think about, I'm going to get the stats wrong, but it's like maybe a 10% Black population. So this percentage is way disproportionate to the amount of the percentage of population. And there's certainly a pattern of this targeted profiling going on. And, we haven't brought a lawsuit based on that, but I know in some cities, like in New York City and Chicago, they've brought the ACLU affiliates and the National ACLU have brought lawsuits based on these kinds of practices of traffic stops. And New York, there was a big lawsuit about stop and frisk where the police were disproportionately targeting minorities in stopping people. And that's not something where I can really give a lot of tips for an individual, but besides to say, if you're someone who does not have white skin, then you might be target. And it's just something you probably already know living in the United States. It's not any news, but the data backs it up that if you've ever felt that way, that's kind of the experience here. And so, like I said, we haven't brought a lawsuit, but that's the kind of thing that we're trying to fight. And we, through advocacy and potentially exploring future lawsuits, we try to figure out how we can best address those practices. And the first step is making people aware that this is happening.
But I have a
Sure.
question. But it just feels like when you're interacting with a police officer, the person is just at a loss, because even if he or she complains that I was pulled or I was racially profiled, the police is just going to deny it.
Yeah, it's really hard. It's really hard both as the individual there to do anything about it. I would say, like you said, saying no, I don't know. This is something where being silent or not saying anything about it with the individual officer is probably best. You're not going to, if that individual officer targeted you, which they may have done so, they're probably not the kind of person who's going to have a change of heart because you tell them that they're being racist.
But
right?
if you say no so many times, they're just going to be like, well, are you not willing to cooperate with the police officer? And that's like a whole other issue.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, you still have to cooperate. If they say, give me your license and registration, you do have to say yes to that. If they say, can I search your car? You say no. And then they say, well, I'm searching your car. You can't say no again. You kind of just have to let them do it. So like you said, yeah, you can't say, you say no, but then like kind of have to end up saying yes still. And they hold all the power, unfortunately, in that situation. I do have a slide and I'll talk more about later, but what happens if you feel like your rights have been violated. And I think what you need to do when you're in one of those situations is start taking mental notes of everything you're seeing as you're seeing it. If you can remember the officer's badge number, the officer's name, they're supposed to have a little badge. They don't always wear it, but they're supposed to have a badge that has their name and it has a special number. In your head, if you can get the officer's name, that's step one. That's so important.
You can
I would,
record. You can record if you're being held, right?
yeah. So you can record. Many officers don't like to be recorded, so they may give you some trouble. I have a slide about that too, but you do have a First Amendment right to record officers, and they can't tell you that you have to stop filming. They can't take your phone away. They can't make you delete it. If you're in a situation with a confrontational person, they might, it might make them more angry if you're doing it. So sometimes that's why those like secret recordings are better, where the officer doesn't know they're being recorded. Sometimes those are better in, a situation, but or if there's a passenger and they can record, that might be better too. But yeah, certainly if you can record it with your phone or whatever you can get in your head, if you can get the badge number, get the name. If they're in a car, the car should have a number on it. And if you can get there's a license plate, and then I think usually the number is on the side. If you can get a number identifying that car, any kind of information you can get in your head, like start thinking about, if I were to like make a complaint, which you can, like there's like city agencies and other kinds of agencies where you can make a complaint against the police. And I'll say, often those complaints, they don't necessarily go anywhere, but that's like a first step. And then the other step is if you were to pursue a lawsuit, if your rights have really been violated. Like really what's so important is to have things like the name of the officer. And unfortunately, so many times people will come to us at the ACLU and they'll say, an officer violated my rights, this is what they did, but the person has no recollection of who the officer was, like who was on duty. And then we have to like comb through and try to figure out who that officer was. And it's very hard to bring a lawsuit when you don't know who you're suing, right? So just like thinking about as much information. Also, like, especially if you're in the city, so there are like people around, if there are any witnesses, make sure you talk to the witnesses and see if you can get, like, if you had a passenger, or if there was like someone on the side of the street there, if you could get their name and number. So you would have a witness, either if it was a complaint that was like filed with the local agency, or if it was a lawsuit, where that's someone who could provide a statement and say, this is what I saw happen. And I was there and I witnessed it. And then recording photos, like if they injure you in any way, certainly taking pictures of that, going to the hospital if there are any injuries involved, which, I certainly hope that will never happen for any of you, but if you are injured, and it's the thing where you're injured because they caused you injury, you're going to want a medical record of that, because if you sue them, they're going to say, well, you weren't injured, you didn't even go to the doctor. So certainly seek medical care if you need it right away.
Molly, this is a little tangential, but were it not for the recording of the whole George Floyd incident, do you think we would have gotten a conviction?
Probably not. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, that's absolutely right. Like, I mean, that
was a game changer.
It's a game changer. Yeah. And it's same with Arbery and so many others. It's having it on film, having those witnesses to events. And I mean, it's just because, I mean, if any of you watched those videos, like when you watch the video, you can't deny what happened, right? And so, yeah, that's why it's good to record, but that's also why the police don't want to be recorded, because they're going to be accountable. So that's why you still have to be careful if you're the one doing the recording. But absolutely. And yeah, I'll just tell you now about a case we just settled with the city of St. Louis. This was she's a real saint. She's an advocate for unhoused people. And she was out in the streets helping people, bringing them food and blankets. And she saw another person who was getting arrested by police for no reason, really. She stayed back a safe distance and she started recording with her iPhone because she didn't like what was happening. And the police really didn't give much reason for why they were arresting this person. They thought he was in the way. They didn't like the color of his skin. They didn't like where he was standing. So he's being arrested. She's just recording him. She's many feet away from him. There's a large group of police officers, and the police officers, a couple of them in particular, notice that she's recording and they start yelling at her to move back, to get away. They tell her that she's interfering, even though she's so far away, like she couldn't touch them if she wanted to. You know, she complies with everything they tell her. They say, stop interfering, but she's far away. She's not doing anything besides recording. They tell her to get in her car. She gets in her car. She can't drive away because there are officers all around, there are cars all around blocking her. They tell her she needs to leave. She keeps recording. They pulled her out of her car, like on the ground. They really hurt her, like really hurt her. And they did all this because they didn't like that she was recording, basically. So we brought a lawsuit on her behalf. And the biggest claim in it was the First Amendment claim that she had the right to observe the police and to film the police. And they argued that she was interfering, that she wasn't listening to what they said. And there was her video, and then there actually were a few witnesses who took videos, and then there were also some police cameras from the city, or the surveillance cameras that are like in the city. So we had like 4 different videos that all showed what was happening, and it didn't look good for the city, which, you know, we ultimately settled, and I think she was happy with the result, but I don't know that we would have even gotten to that point without video, because they would have been able to deny, and they would have been able to say, oh, she was so close that we couldn't do our job. And if you don't have the video, then it's all just he said, she said, and there were many officers telling the same. So, did you have a question? Sorry.
Yes, I just want to know
ahead.
how long is the training for a police officer?
So the police academy, I'm trying to think, it's like maybe 2 years in St. Louis. Someone else here might know that even. So it's very short. Most of them do have like a bachelor's degree or something like that, but then they go through the academy, and then they're supposed to have certain trainings, like annually. They're supposed to have trainings on things like constitutional rights. It's very cursory, and that's one of the things that we explored both in this case and we've explored in other cases, where we're trying to figure out what they actually have to learn and whether they're tested on it, whether they have to be retested on it, and trying to make sure they have better training. But
yeah, because it's just ridiculous that the way they behave. I mean, they're the one with the weapon. They're the one with the what is it, the spray,
right,
and they feel threatened by a cell phone camera.
yeah.
I think the whole issue of training police officers is probably part of a bigger national conversation, like, you know, diversity training and how to handle people who have mental illnesses, because police officers are not always equipped to deal with someone who's having a mental breakdown, you know.
Yes.
That's another big issue. And their family members, the people who call the cops, don't necessarily want you to hurt them. They're probably like, restrain them and take them to a hospital, something like that.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, they're not equipped at all. They're not social workers, like, and they don't have, that also reminds me, another issue in this case, like they don't even have policies in the city of St. Louis for dealing with persons with disabilities. So if like they see a person,
Oh, really?
yeah.
Oh, wow.
So if they saw a person on the street who had a disability and they wanted to arrest that person, there's like nothing telling them how to deal with that situation. And I don't think they have training on that either.
Right.
So it leads to a lot of harm, and often it leads to harm of people who can't necessarily advocate for themselves in that situation. Yeah, so yeah, training, absolutely crucial. Another thing we work on is policy change, so that there are policies that they have to learn these things, but then there are policies, for example, in dealing with persons with disabilities, where they have certain guidelines that they have to follow, and those can provide support to these big constitutional ideas. Like it's often easier to train officers on, these are the 10 things you have to do when you are dealing with a person who's got mental illness, not just you have to uphold their First Amendment rights. It's, this is the way you have to talk to them, and for them to learn like how to deal in those situations.
Right. I mean, a mentally ill person may not even understand what you're saying to them, like the First Amendment. They're gonna,
Right.
probably not their main concern.
Yeah. But it's a constant struggle. And I will say also, like, there are certain officers, like in this case I was just talking about, like one of the worst offenders in that case, he's often been in problematic situations. This isn't the first time he's been sued for violating someone's rights. So I'm not going to say anything about, oh, there's just a few bad apples, but I will say there are some officers who are especially egregious, and there isn't necessarily a good process for disciplining them. There's not necessarily a level of systemic accountability. Even when there's a lawsuit like this, that officer is still allowed to do their job.
I think that was one of the things that made the George Floyd case so unique, because the police department, his police department that he worked for, Derek Chauvin, like they actually testified against him. They were like, we are not okay with this. And that's very rare in police culture. So that was another element.
Yeah, you're so right. Their stories all line up. And another issue we'll have is if it's a situation where, like, we know there were 5 officers there and we don't know which one exactly did the harm, they'll all say, I don't remember. Or like, they'll all say, oh, I didn't do it. And then we have a problem in a lawsuit if we can't pinpoint and say this person did this action. So you're right. It's definitely rare, but also like really helpful when you know that there was one person who was especially bad there.
I never watched the whole video, but I saw the clip on the news when the paramedics showed up, and like you could see that one police officer was still on his neck, and I was just like, oh my God, he still didn't move when the paramedics showed up. So
it's brutal. Yeah, it's just devastating, absolutely devastating. But I'm glad that there was some sense of justice there, and hopefully that bodes well for future. But certainly brings us to the, one of the themes here is you just have to be very careful around police.
Sure.
Yeah. So I might move next to searches, which this could be a whole presentation unto itself. So I'm just going to kind of like touch on the basics of searching, which is what happens if a police officer comes to your home, and what happens if a police officer stops you either on the street or when you're driving and they say, I want to search. So hopefully it's definitely more rare that you're going to have a home search than have a car search. We talked about, so many of us have been pulled over for traffic stops. Most of us hopefully have not had the police at our door very often. But if the police do ever knock on your door, and often when that happens, it's going to be the middle of the night, you don't have to just let them in. That's certainly a situation where saying no is the correct answer. They need to have a reason to come into your house. So the reason might be that they have a warrant, or there might be an emergency, or it could be that you give them consent. Usually, I don't think there would be a reason for you to give them consent. unless, you know, of course, I guess if you had called them for help, you know, if you needed them to come help you, then you might let them in. A warrant, the first thing is, it's literally a piece of paper that they would have. It would be signed by, usually it would be a judge that would sign it. And for a house, to search a home, it should have the address of the home, and it should also talk about what they're searching for. So it can't just say, you can search this address, 123 ABC Street. It should say, you can go into ABC Street, but you need to be looking for these kind of pills or for 3 handguns. It might even
Probable cause requirement? Is that what it is?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Been a
But
while.
yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you get if there's a warrant, then they've already got probable cause, I guess. So like, you know, like you're right, that's the standard, but once they've got the warrant, like they don't need anything beyond what they've already shown to the judge. So like the prosecutor, you know, will go to whatever judge is on warrant duty and say, this is why I've got probable cause. Which, you know, it might be that they know that a person who lives at that location, or they think a person at that location, you know, was in possession of a handgun or something like that. So if someone was to come to your door and say, I've got a warrant to search your home, before you let them in, even if they say I've got a warrant, the best thing to do would be either have them hold it. If you have like a window, you could have them hold it up so you can see it through the window, like through, if there's like a window on your door, or you could like go outside, but don't just automatically let them in. First, step outside and look at that piece of paper and make sure it actually has the address of your home, and then look and see what it says about what they're searching for. And if it's not your home, like if you're a guest there, you certainly don't need to let them in, and you have a good excuse. Then you can say, this is not my home. I don't live here. I can't let you in, even if it's a warrant. If it's not your home, it's not your home. And then, you know, they're going to ask you, well, where's the homeowner? And if they're not there, they're not there. But you don't have the obligation to let them in if you're just a guest. So if you can, the best thing to do if you're a guest is then to say, I don't live here, and go from there. It is hard if there's a quote unquote emergency. And that's something where the Supreme Court has been making decisions recently about when the police are allowed to go into a house. So if, you know, if they got a call from a neighbor that thought there was something going on in the house, or if they're in they call it hot pursuit. If they're in hot pursuit of someone who's running through a house, they might go in. That's a big source of constitutional violations. We actually have an upcoming trial in a case where our trial just has to do with damages. So our trial is going to be about the amount of money. But the police went into a home in the middle of the night. This was a suburban home. And they said that they were chasing after someone who had not paid his cab fare. Someone at 2 a.m. got dropped off in the neighborhood because he hadn't paid his fare, and he was wearing a hat. And so they were chasing him, and they ended up going in, like down the sidewalk into our client's house. There was a garage door that was unlocked. They went through the garage door. They just so they went in through the garage, and then they walked into the house in the middle of the night. And this person had not gone into their house. This person did not live in their house. So, you know, they said that they were in pursuit, but they really you know, it was a big stretch for that to be the case. So that was, I mean, terrifying, absolutely terrible experience for our clients. Unfortunately, no one was harmed, but that was a situation where the police said it was an emergency. And maybe if that person who had not paid his cab fare had been in the house, maybe there would have been a different result. I would hope not, because that's not a reason to go into someone's house. But that was a really interesting case. And so, yeah, like I said, trial just on damages. So we'll see what they get.
Was there a racial profiling element to this case or not?
Interestingly, That was not a big issue. Yeah, I know, a little bit interesting. Yeah, and it was actually a fairly white community too. It wasn't like North St. Louis where these kinds of things happen a little bit more regularly. So that was an interesting aspect of it. There were a lot of really strange things about this case, actually.
I mean, they couldn't wait till like 9 o'clock the next morning to
Right.
show up at his house.
Yeah, there was something really weird about the whole thing. Yeah. So yeah, but the moral is the police can't just go into your house any time of day or night. And if they are coming into your house at 2 a.m. with no reason, call the ACLU because they shouldn't. And then the next aspect of this slide, I guess, is the searching your car, your clothing, your personal items. We talked about the car searches, which is, say no, but they might search it anyway. Similarly, if there's a warrant, like if they were to have a warrant for an arrest, which the warrant for the arrest would have the name of the person on it, they could arrest that person and then they could search that person. And this, Huma brought up like probable cause. When you're just walking down the street, it's a much lower standard than probable cause. It's like reasonable suspicion, but they're what they call Terry stops. They're like some different kinds of stops. So for any lawyers, you might remember that from like criminal law. But the standards are really low. Police can really stop like anyone walking down the street for any reason. And this is another thing where like racial profiling comes in, but even if you're being racially profiled, you kind of usually have to stop. If they stop you and say, I want to search your bag, they don't necessarily have the legal right to do that, but they might do it anyway. So the best thing to do is just comply. And when it's proper to say no, but just know that it might happen, because they might say, we thought that you were committing a crime, which, maybe you were, but often you weren't. But yeah, so just do the best you can to comply. And certainly if you have been arrested, if you're in handcuffs or, if they've taken custody of your vehicle, if you're in that kind of a situation, they do have the right to search you. And if it's something where they shouldn't have arrested you, that's like a whole nother issue. But they will search you in that situation. Yeah, and then the other thing is if they suspect that you have a weapon on you, they can like pat you down, or pat like if you have like a bag, they might like think that they see it and like pat on your bag. So that can be really invasive. It's hard to even if you're doing nothing wrong, even if they pat you down and then they say, okay, you're free to go, that's a huge violation of your rights, isn't it? It's hard.
I have a question. Do these rights apply to children as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Children have the same rights as adults. The Constitution doesn't say that your rights only start when you turn 18 years old. And
no, for the police officer to pat a child down.
Yeah, they do. And that happens, disproportionately. It happens in non-white communities, but it definitely happens. And there are times, like back when I was in law school, I did like a juvenile justice clinic where we represented someone who was, I think he was 14, and he was arrested by officers, and he did have a gun on him. So 14-year-old with a gun, which he said he had it for protection because he lived in a really bad neighborhood and he didn't feel safe. And I believe that. But there was still a search and seizure issue because the officer the kid was walking down the street in the night. And this officer, like, he wasn't even in his jurisdiction. He was an officer who was in a different part of town, but he was like kind of driving through, and he just like pulled over. And he said that he was doing this because he saw a gun sticking out. But we ended up winning on Fourth Amendment search and seizure because the officer was outside of his jurisdiction, and also because he didn't really have a reason to like stop this kid. So I mean, that's the fact that they're 14-year-olds with guns, like that's definitely a scary systemic issue, but also like an officer doesn't have the right to just, go talk to every 14-year-old he sees and start patting them down.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, is that an actual affirmative defense that a police officer is outside their jurisdiction and they arrest you?
Yeah.
Ah, very
Yeah.
interesting.
Which,
Okay.
yeah, I mean, it's not going to happen. But that was just like a weird, rare situation. What was also weird about that case is like for juveniles, for anyone under 18, it's a little different because they have a special court, like a juvenile court, where the rules are different. Like for any lawyers, like they don't follow the normal rules of like civil procedure and things like that a lot of times. So you can kind of talk about things like jurisdiction that you maybe wouldn't have as much room for in another court.
Oh, one question that I have for you, and it comes up a lot on the bar exam. So, a parent consenting to have a police officer search their child's room, like can the parent consent on behalf of the child? That
Yes.
also comes up.
Yeah, that they can. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because that's, I guess, yeah, that's because the parent is the owner of the home.
Mhm.
So yeah, when I say the child has constitutional rights, I guess I should add the caveat that they don't always, and that their parents might have a few more rights than they do, and their parents might be able to override their rights at times. The other thing is in schools, students still have rights. They don't lose their rights because they go to school, but they might, for example, like if the school searches their locker, like they don't have rights to like have their locker be private, which they would think that they should, but a lot of students can lose their rights in a certain way, which that's actually one of the big issues that our affiliate has been working on and is going to continue working on, which is school to prison pipeline issues, because there are students who are getting punished in ways that they call it school to prison pipeline. It's reflective of and also like leads to like the prison incarceration system that we have. And there's school environments where they've got these, like, they call them school resource officers, but they've basically got like police officers on staff, and kids are going through metal detectors, and then they're getting punished like with 10-day suspensions, or in Southern Missouri, there's still corporal punishment is still illegal. So like,
Oh,
kids are
really?
getting beat. Yeah.
Huh, did not know that.
Yeah. So that's an interesting thing about Missouri is it's still legal for a teacher or an administrator to hit a kid in school.
Can kids' backpacks be searched in schools?
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and I don't think that the standards, I mean, I think that they still, they have certain constitutional rights, but I think a lot of those standards, like the school needs very little basis to get past it. So, yeah. So if you're a kid, don't bring your guns to school, please.
That should be obvious.
The world we live in is so strange. It's a strange world. So we already talked about filming police a little bit. I'll just quickly go through this, but you definitely have the right to be in public places. You have the right to observe police. That's really well established. You have the right to film police. That being said, police don't always like to be filmed. So be careful if you are filming them. If you're not in a car, like if you're outside or you're at a protest or something, you should keep a reasonable distance so they can't say that you were interfering with them. And so they can't just, reach out and be physically harmful to you. They would need a warrant to take your phone or your camera. So they would need a piece of paper that says, I can take this or I can look at your phone. They can't just take it, and they can't tell you that you have to delete a video. But if they are in the middle of arresting someone, don't physically insert yourself, even if you know what they're doing is wrong. Keep your distance. And generally, I would refrain from saying things to them too, like yelling at them, because that often would escalate the situation. Yeah, and it's the burden is certainly on the police to de-escalate situations, to act responsibly, to uphold constitutional rights. Like they have that burden and that responsibility. As a citizen, like that really, it shouldn't be your responsibility to tell them what your rights are. But there are times where you just kind of have to be careful, and it's out of like protection for yourself that you have to do it, because they're not always going to abide by what their duties are. So if you are arrested, which, that could happen, because you were a bystander observing, it could happen because you were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or, it could happen because you had a small amount of drugs on you or something, where you had committed a crime. And if you're arrested, I don't think it says stay calm on here, but if you can, stay calm. Once again, if you're religious, say a prayer, or, think happy thoughts to the extent you can. It's going to be a terrifying experience, absolutely terrifying, but do what you can to keep yourself calm and to just observe everything that's going on around you and start taking mental notes of where you are. Don't resist. The minute they say you're under arrest, even if they haven't touched you yet, they mean it. So don't run, don't walk away, don't turn your back, don't tell them that they can't arrest you. You just you have to let them do it. And if it's something where you have a civil rights case, that can happen later, but you at that point, you have to do what they say. That being said, you don't have to answer questions. You should remain silent. If they ask you to tell why you did what you did or something like that, just say, I'm going to remain silent. I'm exercising my right to remain silent. Don't answer any questions. With the exception maybe of like, if they ask you your name, you can tell them your name. But besides that, you don't have to talk to them. And they might try to talk to you just to like rile you up, but just stay silent, and ask for a lawyer. You have a right, if you can't afford your own lawyer, to have a public defender appointed, a government lawyer, which sometimes that process takes a little bit of time and can be a little challenging. In Missouri, unfortunately, there's a shortage of public defense services sometimes, but you should still ask for a lawyer. And if you have the resources to get one for yourself, call a family member. You do have the right to make a phone call. If you've ever seen that on TV shows where you say, I'd like my phone call, that's a real thing. You do have a right to a phone call. But do be aware that if you call someone who's not a lawyer, the people at the station can listen, and they will probably listen. So if you call your husband and you say, I was arrested because I did this, don't say because I did this, because I committed this crime. Say, I was arrested, I need you to help me get a lawyer, this is where I'm located. It's important to tell them where you are. This is what happened, but don't tell them this is what happened in terms of I committed a crime. Say, I got arrested in terms of what happened. And if you are able to call a lawyer for your phone call, I don't think most of us carry around like our lawyer's phone number, but if you're able to, maybe if you're married to a lawyer or something, then you would be able to. Then, that call, the lawyer's phone call, is supposed to be confidential, and they don't listen to those. So it's different when you're talking to a lawyer versus someone else. And certainly immigration status is something not to be discussed with anyone except a lawyer. If arresting officers or the intake officers ask about immigration status, that's something where you can exercise the right to remain silent. You don't have, and when they intake you at the jail, it would be a jail, they might ask those kinds of questions, and you don't have to answer them without a lawyer present. I would answer like my name and my birth date, and then every other question I would say, I'm not answering until my lawyer's here. And certainly anything with respect to immigration. And definitely don't sign anything. If there's any kind of papers in front of you, like sometimes they would have a statement where they would say, oh, we just wrote up a little statement about what happened. Like, just make sure if you want to make any edits and then just sign it. Or like, oh, if you signed this paper, then you can go now and come back later. Or, just sign this and you won't even have to deal with a judge. All kinds of papers, all kinds of reasons. Don't sign it. And any kind of statement that you sign, anything like that, they could use as evidence against you. So be careful.
So you can't lie, but the police officer, they can lie.
Yeah, and they do.
Yes. I mean, if they want to get a confession out of you, they can make up stuff and tell you and mess with you.
So can they search your phone after you have been in jail? No?
They're not supposed to without a warrant.
Okay. Because there was a question someone asked on Facebook, can they search your phone? Obviously, if you're getting pulled over or like a traffic, they can, but I just wanted to make sure, what if you get arrested, they still can't search your phone?
That's a good question. It's a good question. So they're not supposed to. That being said,
But they
might
can.
try. Yeah. So we usually, like when someone's going to a protest or where you're in a situation where you think you might be arrested, we usually say like make sure you have on like really good password protection and privacy settings. So they can't just log into your phone without you. And if you have like the fingerprint or the Face ID, consider deactivating that as well. So they can't just like hold it up to your face and unlock your phone. Because they're not going to be able to search unless they can get into it. So whatever you can do to kind of safeguard it, that might be helpful. But if you are charged with a crime and arrested, like even if they're not supposed to or able to get into your phone right away, like eventually there might be a process by which they can get your text messages, records of who you called, all those kinds of things. So if you were to plan to commit a crime of some kind, I'm not saying, I'm not advising anyone to do that, but if you were, just be aware that your text messages might come out in the process.
Noted.
Yeah. Yeah. So
I do family law, and let me tell you something. Text messages are one of the biggest and easiest ways we catch people in a lie. That and Facebook and social media. So yeah, be careful what you put out there, because eventually we get our hands on it.
Yep. And emails, that's like, I spend days going through emails sometimes. Anything you write, it's never guaranteed that no one else is going to see it. So
that's the thing. If you put it out on the internet, even if you take it down, the odds of it going away completely forever are low. Someone somewhere will see it. I always tell people that if you don't want people to know this, don't put it online.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that's just good life advice for all of us, but it certainly applies if in criminal things. And so also if you've been arrested, we talked about, not signing something. The subset of that is if you don't understand something, either if you don't understand the language or you don't understand what they're saying, you can ask them to explain it to you. Don't sign it if you don't know what you're reading. And if it's a language barrier, you are entitled to an interpreter. So if you speak a different language besides English as your first language and you are having trouble understanding, say, English is not my first language, I need an interpreter in whatever language you need one. And if it's a pretty rare language, it might be hard to come by, and that could cause you to be detained a little bit longer. So that's also something if you have that phone call and you have someone to call, you might have to try to get some help somehow, but they are supposed to provide an interpreter. And certainly if it's like Spanish, interpreters are available. More common languages are easier. So I'm going to talk briefly about specifically discrimination against Muslim women because you two brought that up when we first talked. And interestingly enough, I was talking to one of my colleagues, like the ACLU. In this context, we haven't brought a lawsuit in Missouri. Sorry about my child. If anyone hears her,
It's okay.
apologies. Yeah.
Mine are in and out of here too. That's fine.
It's that time of day. So in Missouri specifically, we haven't brought a lawsuit on this issue, but we did give some guidance to the Department of Motor Vehicles, actually, where they were trying to require that head coverings be removed for taking driver's license pictures, which that is one issue where it comes up a lot, where a woman is wearing a head covering. She just wants to get her driver's license photo taken. And they say, okay, that's fine, take off your scarf. And that's not okay, right? Like, we can't just require that. And all the different states have different requirements and ways around that. So Missouri, probably the easiest way to get around it is they actually have an option where you can get a driver's license with no photo on it. You do have to fill out some paperwork. It's like an exception process where the burden is on you as the applicant to show them that I'm doing this for a religious reason, that I qualify. But then you can go and you can get a driver's license taken with no picture. And they certainly cannot say you have to have a picture with your face or you can't have a driver's license. But that's something to be aware of. And then in the police context, there are cases throughout the country where police have discriminated or harassed or in cases like forcibly removed head coverings. I linked to their CAIR actually has brought some lawsuits. I think it's like the ones I found, it was 2 CAIR lawsuits in California. So I don't know if they were like the national organization brought them or the California affiliate or how that worked. But this one lawsuit, it was a woman who just showed up at a public hearing about police practices. She showed up as a citizen. She was there to make a public comment. She was wearing a hijab, and a police officer said, "Oh, you're in my way. I don't like that you're here." And he ended up forcibly taking it off, arresting her, like handcuffing her, because like she was in the way. Like it's, yeah, just sad and wrong. So CAIR brought this lawsuit with First and Fourth Amendment claims. Like the First Amendment claim was that she had the right to be at this public hearing. She had the right to express herself. She had religious rights to choose to wear a head covering. And then Fourth Amendment claims for search and seizure, that the officer couldn't just take her into custody and arrest her for no reason because he really had no reason. And I just was checking, I think that this lawsuit actually settled. So I don't think it ever like got in front of a jury or anything. And I'm sure the consequences would have been pretty bad of getting in front of a jury. But there was a settlement, which suggests that the city realized that there was a violation here. And one of the aspects of it too was the policy. Like there was discussion of like the city like didn't really have a policy about this. So this is another case where training officers and figuring out policies for how localities can deal with this issue would hopefully help in the future, because the officers would need to be educated that there's so many things wrong with that. So that was an interesting case for sure.
The way police officers deal with hijab, in my experience, it really depends on the community that you're in. Where there's a high Muslim population, most police officers know and understand, but then, you know, if you're in a smaller community where there's, you know, minorities are less in number, it still becomes problematic.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, it's maybe just like a exposure issue. Like, what are they used to?
Hmm.
Yeah. And And I'm guessing like this one California case, it seemed like it was like, because it was an officer about, or it was a hearing about police practices, like this officer was like riled up and angry anyway. He was
Yeah.
like looking for a reason to be mad and just like saw, I think probably he just was like, oh, I see a minority person. And
Right.
that was, he just, went
Lost
into
it.
cold-blooded. Yeah. Yeah, but that's, I don't know. I mean, I think that in Missouri, like, I don't know that we've ever even actually had like a lot of complaints, but that's something that certainly like I'd be interested in doing more advocacy if there are opportunities for it.
This is something that we are looking into because we had attorneys from the EEOC come and speak to us, maybe a month ago. And it has come up in the workplace, and the EEOC lawyers got involved with that. But with police, they didn't have the statistics. I mean, their organization probably doesn't keep it, but yeah, that's something worth looking into.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so we talked a bit about this, but I'll go back over what happens if you think your rights were violated. So what should you do if you are arrested or you're detained and you know that something's wrong? Or you think something's wrong, if you feel like you're not being treated properly. And sometimes it's just that gut feeling, like even if in your head you're like, I don't know if this is a Fourth Amendment or First Amendment, like, but you know that you're not being treated with the respect that you deserve. Just start taking those mental notes. Stay calm, don't resist. Keep remembering the details in your head. Keep thinking about the name, the badge number. If you can, if you have like a piece of paper or your phone and you can write it down, write those things down, because it's so helpful to have that information when you're filing a complaint, to know like who did this. And then once you're back home, writing down the details of the time of day, the day, where you were, the exact location, who was there, if there was any witness. I talked about that earlier. If there was any person there and you can get their contact information, even better if you can get them to like write a statement for you about what they saw. Anything you can do to document what happened there. Take pictures, take video if you can. If you're injured, do seek medical care at a hospital or at a doctor's office, somewhere where you can have medical records. Because if you're bringing a lawsuit, they're going to say, show us your injuries. We want to see pictures. We want to see the doctor's records. Don't say anything. Don't sign anything. You don't know what it is. Get the help of a lawyer. There are a few different processes then for like grievances. In the city of St. Louis, there's a civilian review board that you can submit complaints to. And it's like, technically it's separate from the police officers, and it's supposed to be civilian oversights of the police. I would say their record is not extremely strong of following through on complaints, but they are tracking. And if it's something that's really egregious, like it'll sometimes result in like a discipline for the officer, and they're making records of what's happening. And also, you can reach out to the ACLU if I'll give here. We have a complaint form on our website. It's a little bit, sometimes it can take a little bit of time. I'll say that if you have an issue. So people who submit complaint forms, like sometimes they don't hear anything for a long time, and that can be really discouraging. So honestly, like my email is here and my email's on the website. Like sometimes it's better if you see something to just like reach out directly to one of the attorneys and just send an email with as much information as you can about what happened. And we'll do our best to try to figure out if we can help you or not. And we can't always help. We're a pretty small organization for the amount of things that happen, but we can try to figure it out, and also try to figure out if there's someone else who we could refer you to. Like there our city defenders and MacArthur Justice Center are two other nonprofit organizations that do a lot of work in this space with police cases, and we partner with them, and then sometimes they take their own cases. So So they're good people to reach out to. And then there's also like various like plaintiffs firms, especially if like you've really been injured. There are plaintiffs attorneys that are in pursuit of getting payment for your injuries. And I will say about the ACLU, like we're really focused on strategic change and like impact litigation. So we're usually more interested in the broad policy impacts of what happened and how we can make things right systemically. So like we're really interested in trying to solve the issue of how can we get police better training? How can we get better policies so this doesn't happen again? So we're usually looking for cases where we can really impact those things, where we aren't just getting, I mean, I want everyone who's the subject of police brutality to get, $1 billion, but like we're usually focused on not just getting them that money, but on how we can like really make change for a lot of people because these issues are so systemic. So if you ever reach out to us and we don't get back to you, that might be the reason why, like if we can't take your case, I mean, but certainly do file a complaint if you feel like it's a civil rights issue. And there's also, it's just aclu.org is the national website. They've got a lot of resources about know your rights. If we were in person, I'd probably like have a bunch of the handouts. They have like a lot of know your rights handouts. They have them for dealing with police. They have them for immigrants' rights and for a lot of other issue areas. So if you're ever like curious about these issues or you want some guidance, or, if you're working with an immigrant population or something, you might try checking out those resources to see if there's anything that might be helpful. All right. I don't know if we have a few minutes for any kind of questions that are left.
So we have had, so people did send in a couple of questions. Most of the questions you answered about interaction, recording, for a badge number and all that. There are two questions. First one is, how do I file a complaint against a police officer that stopped me?
Yeah, so there's, I don't know where this, is this person who's asking in St. Louis or?
Probably, yeah.
Okay, so yeah, in St. Louis, there's a civilian oversight board. Can
you just Google it?
Yeah, let me.
No, I'm just saying that's usually how I find stuff.
Yeah. Well, that's actually what I was like. I could stop screen sharing and I could drop it in the chat, or what I can do is I can email it to you guys later and email you the website so then you can circulate that.
That would be great.
Yeah, the Civilian Oversight Board is where I would start if you were in St. Louis. I think that Kansas City might have something local. I'm just making a note that I'll email you the link for that. And so the Civilian Oversight Board, like they have like a 2 or 3 page form that you fill out where you include as much information as you can about what happened. It's a slow review process. There's not always much result. You don't always, if you're the person submitting it, you might not always know like what happened in the end. But that's certainly something that we would encourage you to do if you feel, even if it's like an issue where you're like, I know they didn't violate my rights, but they treated me disrespectfully, or I don't know that I could bring a case based on it, but I think I was racially profiled. It's worth filing a complaint so that that officer might face some accountability and someone will read that and say, this person did this. And then the other thing, if you want to submit a complaint to the ACLU, we would encourage you, if your rights have been violated, we can't take every case, but we can do what we can to try to help you.
And second question is, can Homeland Security Department search your house without warrant or search your phone at the airport?
At the airport was this?
Yes.
Yeah, so without a warrant, they're supposed to still have a warrant to search your house. At the airport, as far as I know, they're supposed to have a warrant to search your phone, but that's one of those things I think they're going to get away with, if I'm perfectly honest. So you just have to be careful. And they do have there were all this carve out of, I was saying like officers, they can't ask for your papers, they can't do anything, immigration officers, especially at an airport or at a border, they have a lot of power to search your items. They have a lot of power to ask you for papers. If you're at an airport or you're at a border and someone says, I want to see your immigration papers, you have to say yes. You can't really say no. Or another situation would be like if you're applying for a visa or something like that. But that being said, if you are detained by ICE, you still have the constitutional rights where you don't have to talk. You can remain silent. You don't have to tell them, if you're in a detention facility, you don't have to tell them about your immigration status, as an example, and you still have a right to a lawyer. You have a right to translator. So most of those rights you still have at that point. But it's hard because sometimes it ends up, as you all may know, like they're not always as accountable.
So it seems like what you're saying is your constitutional rights, when you're dealing with immigration officers at a border or in the airport, they can get whittled down to a certain degree. So the expectation that you're going to have the same protection when you're dealing with a police officer is not necessarily true.
Yeah, you don't have many rights when you're in those situations.
Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, fortunately, you've planned to be in those places, so you can plan for that. But you're running a big risk there if it's a situation where you could be in trouble for something. The best advice I would give if you're an undocumented immigrant, if you're a non-citizen with some kind of an immigration issue, is to, if you know you're going to be in that kind of a situation, honestly, be prepared to be detained, be prepared to be away from your family, have in your head phone numbers of your family, a phone number of an immigration attorney, make sure that someone in your family has a copy of your immigration papers, of all your documents. Make sure there's childcare arrangements, like just be prepared for the worst case scenario.
Okay. Well, I think that is all for the questions that we have. Anything at home you want to add?
No, I think Molly did a very thorough job, and we asked so many of our questions during the session. We usually hold them until the end, but
I like it that way.
Yeah.
It made it a better conversation. And yeah, I so appreciate you letting me speak, and would love to keep the conversation going. Like if there's other issues that you think about.
Yes, we would definitely, I think having a session on search and seizure would be great.
Yeah.
That's a huge issue too.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you, Molly, so much for joining. This was very informative and I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Molly.
All right.